Hello and welcome to this wonderful, wonderful conversation. I am Africa Brooke and I'm a consultant. I'm an accredited life and business coach and I'm a writer. And the session that we're going to be doing today is going to be a focus on how to move from self-censorship and into mindful expression. And we're going to be going through this in a pretty dynamic way because I wanted to make sure that you're not just hearing me talk, that you're actually seeing what this could look like in action. It's going to have elements of, we're going to get a little bit interactive with this as well. So I really want you to bear with me. And although I'm going to be giving you a lot of information, I really don't want you to rush yourself. So I invite you to actually take your time to really consider some of these things, because you will be taking this work with you way beyond the session itself. And we'll try to have a little bit of fun with it as well. One of the things, before we dive into all of the nitty-gritty, I just wanted to give you a few notes to consider. So one of the first things, and I always do this with my own clients, as a coach, I always trust that you already have most of the answers that you need, okay? You just require support in your learning process and in actually gaining the clarity. So in this conversation, in this partnership that you and I are having right now, I'm going to be giving you suggestions and tools, but ultimately you get to decide what your roadmap is going to look like. That's another invitation that I'm going to make. I want you to think of this session as a roadmap. You're creating something that is going to be a little bit intangible to begin with, but then you have to make it tangible beyond the session. Last note that I want to share with you is that gaining insights on your own is infinitely more powerful than me telling you what you should do or what you should think. And it's, you know, it's no secret that we are in a time right now where we're being told how we should feel, what we should agree with, what we should think. And I want to allow you, I really want to allow you to remember that you are an autonomous adult. You get to decide what you will do, what you will not do, and how you think. And also the thing is, when you reveal your own inner resources, it really is much more stimulating and also fulfilling. So the way that this session is going to be presented to you, I'm going to take you through 3 key phases. The first phase is going to be awareness. The second phase is going to be responsibility. And the third phase is going to be expression. And I really do believe and have come to see from working with so many people that these 3 phases are essential if you are going to be moving from self-censorship and into what I call mindful expression. So to even understand any of these concepts that I will present, we need to be on the same page around what self-censorship actually is. So we're going to go into the clear definitions, just so we all know what we're working with. So self-censorship is the act of intentionally and voluntarily withholding information from others and from yourself. So it's not just about the things that you choose to not say to other people, but you might find yourself even censoring yourself in your own mind, punishing yourself for thinking in a certain way, feeling very fearful for even daring to think outside of the box, outside of the norm, to have those unpopular thoughts. So self-censorship happens in a very sophisticated way for most of us. It's not just about others, it's about you. Self-censorship also stems from a theory called groupthink. This is a term that I'm sure many of you have heard, but I think it's one of those things where we don't really know what it actually means. So groupthink is the practice of thinking or making decisions as a group in a way that discourages creativity or individual responsibility. And we're going to be talking about responsibility quite a bit in this session, so I want you to really remember that part. So people can self-censor for several reasons, but it's usually done out of fear or pressure. And it's often used as a form of self-protection from actual or perceived emotional, physical, material is another one that I should have added here, or occupational harm. So when you look at this through the lens of what people refer to today as cancel culture, you can see what this looks like, right? A lot of the fears that people have are not irrational. People have seen what happens when you have an opinion that is not really deemed as popular, when you have an opinion that the majority disagrees with, when you have an opinion that might be controversial. You know, we've seen what happens, but sometimes it doesn't even need to be a controversial opinion. It could just be people deciding that they don't like you speaking in this way, or maybe you're the wrong messenger and you might get attacked for it online or offline, usually online. So I do want you to realize that if you find yourself beginning to notice that actually you've been operating from a fearful place, really be compassionate with yourself as you listen to this. It is not about self-shaming. It's just about bringing awareness to some of the areas where you might need to take more risks, where you need to become a better communicator. We'll talk about that as well. But I do want you to know that the fears that you have are not always irrational. And we'll get into that as well. Last thing that I want to share with you around self-censorship is that, and this is a big one, this is one that I see with almost all of my clients in one way or another, and many people in my audience as well. And even within myself, I started to see this. We can even find smart ways to justify censoring ourselves. And if you are someone that considers, you know, if you consider yourself to be a smart person, to be an intelligent person, maybe you're very good at articulating your internal experience, you might find yourself positioning self-censorship as common sense. And this is just one example of self-censorship being a form of self-sabotage. This is another thing that I want you to remember as well. And a question that I get all the time is, okay, Africa, I understand what self-censorship is. Yes, we need to encourage people to be able to say what is on their minds, but does this mean that everyone gets to say whatever they want to say with no consequences? Does this mean that people can be as bigoted as they want to be and we just have to accept it? So people kind of start to go to the extremes when we are having these conversations around self-censorship. And I get it. You know, the mind is a very binary tool. We want to make sense. We want to make sure that we're safe. So we usually sort of go to the extremes. But I want you to remember that undoing self-censorship does not mean you don't use your social filter. Having a social filter is a very good thing, okay? So your social filter is the way you appraise a social situation to know the appropriate reaction or response to such a situation. So your social filter requires you to think before you speak. And when you lack self-trust, when you lack self-confidence, and you don't have the ability to judge well and to communicate confidently, it can quickly become self-censorship. So the reason I'm saying this is because I want you to know that there is a difference. There is a distinction between self-censoring, which is usually done from a place of fear. You believe that something is going to happen to you. There are going to be consequences to your thoughts, to your ideas, to your speech in whatever form, right? It's a very different thing from having a social filter, which comes from a grounded place. It comes from a place of trusting yourself. It comes from a place of you having and practicing discernment, right? The ability to judge well. So your social filter is a very, very good thing. And I never want you to confuse that for self-censorship because they are different. So your social filter allows you to assess which thoughts you should verbalize, because we can all agree that not everything that you think needs to be verbalized, right? And which should be kept to yourself. And this will be based on the situation, your audience, and your capacity as well. So that has to do with boundaries, right? So context needs to be taken into account when we're having conversations like this. But I do want you to know that this is not about saying whatever the hell you want to say with no consequences, because there are consequences to all speech, but you have to fine-tune your social filter. So the first phase that we're going to be going into, because remember, I said there are three, and I really do believe that they are supportive of each other. The first part is awareness. And before we get into an exercise that I have here for you, I just want you to remember that you're here to focus on what you can control. There are so many things that are outside of our control, so many things that are happening on a wider scale, so many things that are happening globally. And this fact can really overwhelm a lot of people where we start to give up on ourselves. We think, okay, well, what's the point of me even working on any of those things when, you know, there is such a thing as cancel culture, when we are in a time where people are more divided than ever? What is the point of me even working on any of this? Well, this is for your well-being. This is for your mental health. This is to strengthen your interpersonal relationships. It's also to strengthen the relationship that you have with yourself. And I'm a big advocate for focusing on what you can control. So that's why we're going to look at your willingness to self-censor scale. Because without understanding what your willingness to self-censor is, you're kind of going to be working through this from a place of not being rooted in anything that is deeply connected to your personal experience. So you might feel motivated and inspired by this conversation, but because you haven't really got clear on how self-censorship presents itself in your life, you won't really be able to commit to the process enough. So I have this exercise that I refer to as the willingness to self-censor scale, and it will just give you an idea of where you are right now, what your starting point is. So for each statement that I will read out, indicate whether you strongly disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree, or strongly agree. So just bear with me. If you have a notepad, if you can come back to this, just write these down and do come back to this. Even take a photo on your phone, just so you have this exercise, because it is also something that I would advise that you come back to every now and again. It's not a one and done. You can come back to this in a few months' time, even in a year's time, okay? So for each statement, again, I'm going to repeat it, indicate whether you strongly disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree, or strongly agree. And don't spend too much time on any of these questions either, okay? We don't want to end up over-intellectualizing, because I know just how easy it can be to over-intellectualize and to do what I call giving yourself a PR answer. Don't answer this from the place that you wish you were at. Answer from where you are right now, and answer with your first impression. So number one, it is difficult for me to express my opinion if I think others won't agree with what I say. 2, when I disagree with others, I'd rather go along with them than argue about it. 3, it is easy for me to express my opinion around others who I think will disagree with me. 4, I'd feel uncomfortable if someone asked my opinion and I knew that they wouldn't agree with me. 5, I tend to speak my opinion only around friends or other people I trust. 6, statement 6, it is safer to keep quiet than publicly speak an opinion that you know most others don't share. And really do answer these as honestly as possible, because the more honest you are, the more you'll be able to actually take yourself through this ongoing process, because it's not going to be a magic pill of any kind. It's not all just going to be done after this session. We're just bringing awareness to what's really happening in your internal world so that you can navigate your external world a little bit better. So be as honest with these as possible. And also, something to bear in mind is that a lot of this is context dependent. Maybe you do find that it's difficult for you to express your opinion when it comes to your family, but actually in your friendship groups and maybe with your audience, maybe with your colleagues, you're able to actually express some things that are maybe a little bit unpopular. Maybe you are able to ask those questions. Maybe you are able to debate a little bit more. So yes, a lot of this can be context dependent, and culture is a very big part of this as well. If you're from a culture that is very conservative, if you're from a culture that believes maybe that women shouldn't express certain ideas, or if you're from, let's say, maybe you grew up in a home where you were in a fundamentalist religion, there'll be so many nuances and different things that shift what your answer is going to be. But I do want you to think about what the default is for you, so we can really understand where you are on the willingness to self-censor scale. But also what we're trying to do with this, and this is huge, this can be an absolute game changer if you allow it to be, okay? What we're also trying to do with this is figure out what your default communication style is, because something else that I've discovered in doing this work around self-sabotage, especially for the past 6 years, is that a disconnected society requires more healthy, assertive communicators. A lot of us are very passive. A lot of us are very passive aggressive. This used to be me as well. A lot of us are aggressive, but we think we're being assertive, when actually training yourself to be an assertive communicator in your interpersonal relationships, whether that's in your family relationships, in your romantic relationships, with your colleagues, with your partner, with strangers. And we'll go into the details of what it actually means to be an assertive communicator. But any disconnected society really needs healthy communicators. So you have a lot of people struggling right now in the current culture that we're in, because a lot of us are very passive. A lot of us are very passive aggressive. So we're not expressing our boundaries. We're not expressing our needs. We're not stretching ourselves outside of our comfort zone. We're not willing to take some kind of risk. And we're going to talk about risk a little bit as well. But that's really something to remember, which is why that exercise is really important. Where are you on the willingness to self-censor scale? Because once you have that answer there, it will start to give you an idea of what your default communication style might be. So that is what we're going to do now. Again, I really don't want you to put forward your PR answer. It's not about that. Don't give an answer from the place that you wish you were at. Don't give an answer based on maybe some kind of shame that you're holding around being honest with yourself. You don't have to share any of this. This is just about you. So what is your default communication style? Really think about that, because there are 4 main types. First one, passive. So when you are passive, you tend to be quiet. You don't seek attention. You don't share your needs or express your feelings. You act indifferent in debates. You have an inability to say no. And on a physical level, because again, communication is not just about what you say, it's also your entire physical body as well. You communicate. Nonverbal communication is one of the biggest ways in which we communicate. So maybe it's poor posture. Maybe you tend to give in to others. You have an apologetic demeanor, a lack of eye contact, rarely taking a strong stance or asserting yourself. And then all of this usually means that you end up dealing with quite a lot of built up anger and resentment. And again, I said this in the beginning when we were just starting, but be very kind to yourself as you're hearing this. This is not about shaming. This is not about evoking guilt. And even if any of those feelings come up, just observe them. Don't get overattached. Try to be as neutral and as honest as possible when it comes to this. Let's not apply any meaning that doesn't need to be applied. We just want to find out, right? We just want to gather data so we can change something. So passive is the first one. And then the second one is aggressive. And when you're aggressive, you tend to be very argumentative. You dominate conversations. You criticize, you blame, attack others, very controlling and demanding. entitled, and you're not afraid to challenge others, which is a good thing, right? Because we need that. But you often do so in an unproductive way. And you tend to be straightforward and precise, which again, when used correctly, can be a very, very good thing. But the thing is, when you are an aggressive communicator, it tends to be very ineffective a lot of the time. Maybe sometimes you do get your way and it works out, but on the whole, it tends to be very ineffective. And then being defensive is also a part of that as well. So I just want you to see if you can notice that in any of your communication styles, or maybe you start to observe, as we said earlier as well, that in some situations you're more passive than others. Because when it comes to communication styles, they look different all the time, because different people evoke different things within us. It will also depend on the relationship that you have with the person, how safe you might feel. But at the end of the day, we all have a default communication style. Third one is passive aggressive. And like I was saying, this used to be my biggest one, because my biggest area when it came to this was romantic relationships. I always felt that I couldn't actually express my needs and what I really felt, because a part of me always thought that it would end badly. So I would just hold on to all of these things, and eventually it would express itself in indirect ways, which is a big part of how having a passive aggressive communication style, that's one of the problem areas for people. So with people that have passive aggression as their communication style, they might seem neutral and passive on the surface, but they harbor resentment and they express it indirectly. They can also use subtle sabotage to get even. Maybe it's an overuse of sarcasm. They can be very condescending. And the words don't often align with the actions as well. Complaining can also be a big part of that. Difficulty taking responsibility for actions. They can deny that there is a problem. And this is one of the most common communication styles for people. Last one, and this is what we all want to be aiming for, assertive. So something that I might have mentioned is that a lot of people confuse being aggressive for being assertive. You will have people maybe that say things like, well, I just tell it how it is. And they kind of wear this as a cloak, you know, they're the person who just tells it how it is. But it's that kind of person, again, that ends up being very ineffective, the kind of person that ends up just hosting very unproductive conversations with people. They might be saying the right thing, because here's the thing, it's not about what you're saying, it's about everything else that comes with it. It's about your tonality, it's about the tact, it's about the delivery, it's about having a social filter that is well oiled. But you will have people that are aggressive thinking that they're being assertive, when actually being assertive means that you have a healthy expression of ideas and feelings. You maintain eye contact, and even just your body in itself. You can just command that air of assertion without even having to say anything. You allow people to speak. You understand and you communicate your limits and boundaries without being overly aggressive or defensive. You have a clear, strong voice. You allow yourself to be compassionate. You allow yourself to be empathetic. But at the same time, you do take a strong stance in certain things. You are led by your values. So these are just some of the things that I want to put forward for anyone that is sort of struggling to really conceptualize some of these ideas. Your communication style has a lot to do with it. And also, if you're assertive, you won't allow other people to manipulate you, and you feel competent and in control. You don't try to control everything, but you do feel in control. You're grounded in who you are as a person. You have a sense of self-trust. You don't have to dominate conversations. You don't have to blame. If you realize that actually you were wrong about something, you're able to say, you know what, I was wrong. I was wrong about that, right? You're able to debate in a healthy way. You're able to disagree in a healthy way. You're able to handle conflict. So these are just some of the things that we really do want to embody as we move from complete self-censorship, or even just slight self-censorship, which again is very different from exercising a social filter, and into mindful self-expression. We need to work on being assertive communicators. Second thing that I would like to speak to you about, which is the second phase. So now you have the awareness, you know what self-censorship is, you know that it's different from having a social filter, which is a good thing. You understand where you are on the willingness to self-censor scale. And based on that, you're starting to have an idea of what your communication style is. Yes, it looks different from person to person, situation to situation, but you do have a default communication style, okay? Now, what do you do with that? Now you're going to take responsibility for all the things that you have brought to the surface. You are going to take responsibility so that you can end up expressing whatever you want to express in a healthy and mindful way. And one of the best ways to really start understanding the importance of taking responsibility for all your unthinkable thoughts, you know, for the shift in identity that you want to express, you know, because another area where people censor themselves is when they are no longer the same person, right? Maybe you've been in a long-time relationship, and I mean, one of the longest relationships we'll all have is with our family. So sometimes maybe you grew up never putting forward boundaries. Maybe you grew up being quite passive, always saying yes, feeling that you have to please. Maybe with your friends, it was the same thing. But through your own self-work, you decide that actually, no, I'm not that same person anymore. I do have these boundaries now. This is no longer okay. But we often feel as though we owe people the version of ourselves that they are most comfortable with. So you will have people fragmenting themselves and self-censoring. That's another way in which it manifests for a lot of people as well. But you have to take responsibility for your inner world. And one of the best ways to do that is to get very clear on what your core values are. Very clear on what they are. So I put down some examples here in case, you know, maybe values is just a term that you've often heard about when you come to a new company and they're telling you what their company values are. It always feels very sort of rigid and stale, but values really allow you to see what you find important. And I always say this, but the results you see in your life will show you what it is you truly value. Whether it's your financial situation, your work situation, the relationships that you have, how you spend your time off, the things you find pleasure in, the things you invest in, that shows you what it is that you actually value. But we need to have the language, because then you can allow yourself to have a very strong foundation that is not led by, you know, ideology or politics or what other people think you should do. You can consult yourself. So I think having a very strong value system can really help with that. So I invite you to think about at least 4 that are your core values. And we usually have our, what I call embodied values. So these are things that you have already fully embodied, and the results in your life show you that actually, yes, I do honor these values. And then we have desired values, where we wish these were things that we had fully embodied, but maybe we're not quite there yet. So it's important to also, again, be very honest about what your embodied values actually are versus your desired values. So maybe you think you value things like integrity, but you find that depending on who you're having a conversation with, you will agree with things you don't actually agree with, or you will be swayed by, you know, the most dominant person in the room, or you will suppress your own opinion and your own idea just to, you know, be liked by other people. So maybe integrity is something that you really wish you could embody, but you're not quite there yet. And again, don't shame yourself. It's not about guilting yourself. Just get curious, like, that's quite interesting. I thought that I was there with integrity, but I guess I'm not, right? So make that list of your embodied values and then your desired values. And then going forward, we really want to work on you integrating your desired values into your everyday life. Just those little small moments where maybe before you would have agreed with something you don't agree with, but then you actually say, no, I don't agree with that. Or I don't really have an opinion on that right now. Or I don't know enough to have an opinion on that. Or whatever that might look like in the interaction you're having, right? It can happen in those really small moments. And another thing that I always invite people to think about in relation to responsibility, what are you willing to risk? And the reason I really like posing this question to myself, to my clients, to my friends, to my partner, is because we often think that all of this should just happen because we want it to happen, right? I want to stop self-censoring, and I came to this session and I read this book and I listened to this podcast. Okay, now I have the knowledge that I need. It's just going to happen. No, we need to be willing to risk something. And I always say that your comfort is the bare minimum. When I started thinking about what I wanted to risk to really free myself from self-censorship, I realized that my mind by default was kind of going to the extreme. If I actually speak up, or if I object, or if I say I don't agree with this, I might lose my friends, I might lose my job, I might lose my clients, I will lose opportunities, the mind goes right to the extreme. But we can allow ourselves to really be in the gray area a little bit when it comes to this, which is why I always say your comfort is the bare minimum. That's a good starting point. But other things that I then added onto my list were other people's perception of me. I'm willing to risk that. Popularity, I'm willing to choose truth over popularity. Certain opportunities that could maybe enhance my image and my finances, but it's going to be at the cost of my integrity. I'm willing to risk those things. They're not that important. And then I just met myself where I was each time without having to do anything too big, anything too audacious, anything that, really rattled my nervous system. But at the end of the day, I had to be very clear on what I was willing to risk. And it might involve relationships, right? Another thing to think about in terms of this values-based approach to responsibility is that once you actually define what your values are, they do act as a foundation to hold you up when you remove the censorship filter. They allow you to be very clear on what it is that you actually stand for. So instead, you can strengthen your social filter and really work on embodying your desired communication style, which I would imagine for most people is being a more assertive communicator. And knowing that to be an assertive communicator does not by any means mean you have to be the loudest, you have to be the most outspoken everywhere all the time. That's not what it means. It's a very grounded internal process that starts to externalize itself the more you commit to it, even when it's very uncomfortable to do so, okay? Which leads us to the final part of all of this. Again, there are 3 phases that I do really believe are in support of each other. For a lot of people, they try to jump to the expression phase, even people that I work with, it's what is the strategy? What do I say when this happens? What do I do? And I could give you a strategy, I can give you a script. However, without laying a foundation for it, it's going to be very difficult for you to actually sustain it. You will continue to feel as if you're performing, as if you're sort of just regurgitating all of these lines that you should say, when actually it's not rooted in anything meaningful for you. So all of this is a very slow and often unsexy and very quiet process of just building trust within yourself before you even start to externalize any of this. So when it comes to putting the theory into practice, first thing that I always say to people is do not make sharing publicly the priority, okay? Mindful expression is best practiced in your offline interpersonal connections. Really begin with the people that are around you, the people that you trust. And if there's no one around you that you feel like you can bounce ideas with, start to tune into different thinkers, even people you don't necessarily agree with. So you can build your internal tolerance for different ideas, for different beliefs, for different voices. And it's not even about agreeing, it's just so you can really start to understand that there are different ways to express, okay? But do not make sharing publicly the priority, because it's something that people do prematurely, and then they start to feel an imbalance. So don't rush yourself to share anything. If you feel motivated and you feel inspired, you feel like, okay, censorship is coming to an end, I'm going to share this thing. You can do so if you choose to, but really allow yourself just to be with it, to sit with it, to do that internal stuff, to focus on changing things in your day-to-day life and your interpersonal connections, and start small and increase your capacity for risk. So you don't compare yourself to me or to anyone else or to your boss or to that person that you know who's outspoken. You don't have to rush yourself with any of this. Start small, meet yourself where you are, and then you're going to slowly work your way up to becoming who it is you want to be, which is a very big thing. You know, for a lot of people, we change, you know, we don't agree with who we were even 2 weeks ago. With new information comes a new way of being. So you have to really allow yourself to be in that for as long as necessary. And when it comes to putting theory into practice as well, I do just want to remind you to be more discerning about what you engage with. You don't have to attend every fight that you're invited to. You don't always have to jump in with an opinion, jump in with a thought. Sometimes you might have something you could say, but you know what? You're going to save your capacity for this one. For example, if it's something that's happening online and you feel compelled to say something, you feel compelled to share, you feel compelled to enter the argument or the debate, just realize that we're trying to have, for the most part, very rich, nuanced conversations on platforms that are so flat and rigid, for platforms that make it very difficult to have these conversations in an effective way, which is why, going back to point one, I really invite you, in terms of really understanding and working on the piece of expression, focus on your interpersonal connections. And then once you really build your confidence when it comes to that, online sharing and whatever else will just be the byproduct of something much more profound. So that's always something that I wanted to share as well. And the last thing, and the very last thing that I'll share, I know that I've thrown a lot of information at you here, but the final part of all of this, and I think it is one of the most exciting parts, is that you get to hold yourself accountable to what happens next. It's not about me holding you accountable. You don't have to wait for someone else to tell you that you've done a good job. You can do all of this for yourself. And I try to make these sessions as simple and accessible as I can in terms of it actually being integratable into your daily life, because I encourage you to just take it very slow and to make sure that it's actually a sustainable process. So a question that I'll leave with you, something to consider. What commitment are you making today to move out of self-censorship and into being a mindful and assertive communicator? Is it a conversation that you need to have? For a lot of people, it usually is in some way, maybe even in a small way, but also, are you making a commitment to be as truthful and as honest the next time you're with that friend who's always playing devil's advocate? Maybe you express yourself in a different way. Just think of the commitment that you're going to be making. Are you going to be stopping agreeing with things that you don't really agree with? And it doesn't mean you have to insert your opinion, but maybe it just means the examples that I was saying before. It could be just responding as, you know what, I don't have anything to say about this. I don't have an opinion on this. I don't know enough to say something on this right now. If someone asks you to do something and you don't want to do that thing, instead of people pleasing and saying, yeah, of course, I'm going to take on more things, even though I'm already burnt out. So, you know what, let me think about that and I'll come back to you. Or say, I'm so sorry, I don't have the capacity for that right now, right? It's about your tonality and about your delivery and you being assertive within yourself, and then it will express itself in the way that you really want to. So I really hope all of that was useful. I hope there's even one thing that you can take with you and actually apply in your daily life. But I'm really excited to see what you do with all of this.
Wonderful. Africa, thank you so much. I got several insights from this, but I want to start our conversation with a question, which is, I notice I'm very curious to learn more about you. And how, as a young person, you mentioned to me that you're 29 years old as we're having this conversation. you have the kind of commanding and clear presence that I experience being with you. Tell me a little bit about your journey.
Yes, of course. Oh, thank you for that reflection. Thank you very much, Tami. A little bit of about my journey. Okay, I'll give you the short version. So I was born and raised in Zimbabwe. And we left the country when I was 9 years old. And then we arrived in the UK in 2001. And I grew up at a time where I very much had a pleasant childhood. I had a very active, fun childhood, but there was also another side to that as well. My father was an alcoholic, and he could be very, very physically abusive. He was abusive to my mother. He was abusive to me and my siblings, physically abusive. So that was one of the first, when I often think about where I started self-censoring, I think this is why it's a very important subject to me, because I learned to self-censor at a very, very young age. Because if we said the wrong thing around my father, there were physical consequences to pay for it. So we had to always be on his time, sort of in his mind, never knowing what version of him we were going to get. There were a lot of things we couldn't say around him, even seemingly normal, simple things. So that was one of the first periods of my life where I now realize I became very well trained at self-censoring and lying as well, actually, as a form of self-protection. But my story is that I came to the UK as an immigrant at 9 years old. And then by the time I was 14, I started drinking myself. Started drinking, as you know, something that you just do as a young person, especially the drinking culture here in the UK is a serious, serious thing. It's kind of just seen as a rite of passage. Started drinking at 14, but unlike my friends, I blacked out the very first time that I drank. And after that, I blacked out pretty much every other time that I drank. So I trained myself to be a binge drinker. It wasn't, of course, at 14, it's not for the taste, it's not for anything other than getting as trashed as possible. But then that's the training that I sort of gave myself up until the age of 24 when I finally got sober. So the reason that I say this is from 14 years old up until I was 24 for a decade, I was a blackout drinker, a binge drinker. And with that came a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of apologizing for things that I couldn't remember, a lot of disconnecting with my family, repeating the patterns that my father had repeated. So my mum, it's almost like she was experiencing my dad, who passed away in 2004. So it was almost as if she was experiencing him through my body, through my being. So I really wanted to stop drinking, but for some reason I just couldn't stop. And it's not even that I drank every single day. I wasn't physically dependent on alcohol. It's just that every time that I did drink, I would go into a binge spiral. I would be gone for maybe a few days or more. And the longest that I actually blacked out for was probably 8 hours, where I don't remember anything that happened. And I woke up in a completely different part of the UK, just outside of London, maybe a couple of hours outside of London. And I had many moments of, I need to stop, but why do I keep doing this? I can see the results of what is happening, but why do I keep doing this? And of course, I didn't have the kind of language that I'm using right now. It was just an internal knowing and exhaustion. And after 7 relapses, I finally got sober in 2016 at 24. And I always say what kept me sober, I've always been a big reader. I've always been someone who's so curious, such a curious person. I've always liked to read. I've always wanted to understand. I've always enjoyed learning about psychology and the human mind and why we do the things we do, whether that's through fiction or nonfiction. I've always just sort of inhaled anything that can give me information. And what I always say, what kept me sober that 8th time was that instead of shaming myself and being so stuck in my own subjective experience, I started to get curious about why I was constantly in this pattern of maybe stopping drinking and then getting uncomfortable because it's actually working, and then starting to drink again. That's when I came across the concept of self-sabotage. And that's when I started studying this idea of when we get in our own way, when we don't think we're deserving of good things. So we're so familiar with chaos and drama and things not working out that it feels safer to be in that space than things actually working out. And then I ended up getting trained a couple of years later. I just started sharing my story around that time, ended up accidentally building an audience. Anytime that I felt I was going to drink, anytime that I thought I would relapse, I would just write about it. I would just share. And then I just started getting invited to speak about my story, and I would share my research and my findings around self-sabotage. And then I ended up getting trained in different methodologies, got trained in coaching psychology, just so I could really understand, so I could self-coach, but then I could also support other people. And it sort of just snowballed from there. So 6 years on, it's just become a big part of my work, really understanding why we self-sabotage, which is essentially a form of self-protection, just in very unfortunate ways, and self-censorship. So that's what kind of leads me here today.
Yeah, and one thing I'm curious about, you mentioned how it felt more normal to you, more comfortable for a while to be in a chaotic, high drama kind of state. How did you make that passage to a new way of being where clarity and assertive communication and being in your values without all that drama became your sense of home?
Yeah, I would say that happened maybe a few years into my sobriety. And it took a lot of getting used to, because I had to almost change my entire worldview. I had to remind myself that I'm actually deserving. There was a lot of stuff around deservingness, which it usually is for a lot of people. I had to remind myself that despite my upbringing and despite what was familiar, I'm actually deserving of peace. I deserve to actually feel that I have thriving relationships where I don't feel guilty about things that I've done. Or so I would say that there's no specific process, if you will, but I had to sort of convince myself. And I would say that even to this day, I still have to remind myself that actually I am deserving of this relationship. I am deserving of this opportunity. I get to be the version of me that experiences peace in many different forms. And I think reading was a big part of that as well, but also getting support. I was in therapy for a period of time as well, just so I could get that objective perspective. And it was also speaking to the people around me, hearing stories from my mother, from my sister, and also just being affirmed as a person, having the people around me reminding me that even though I've been through all of these things and I did all of these things, I'm still a worthy person. I'm still a great sister, a wonderful daughter, a good lover. So I would say it was a combination of things. It wasn't even just me and what I did. I think it was really important to have a strong support system that would continuously remind me, even when I would forget as well. And in terms of being an assertive communicator, I think I remember when I would do talks at the start of my journey, my hands would shake so much. I would be saying what I need to say, but my hands, it's almost like my body wasn't congruent with my speech and my mind. And what I realized about that was it's because I was doing something new. I was simply, that's it. I was doing something I'd never done before. So of course I was scared. And then the more that I did it, the more comfortable I became, the more my body adjusted, the more that I reminded myself that, I deserve to be here, that I got booked for a reason, that my story does matter. And then the more that I did it. So it's also that just the very real practice that comes with a lot of this. There's what happens in the mind, but then there's the actual application and repetition, whether it's repeating certain thoughts to yourself or repeating certain actions until it just becomes a part of who you are.
And Africa, if you could just speak directly to that person who's listening, who says, worthiness is my challenge. I hear what you're saying. I hear that you had this support group. My support group maybe is a little shaky. I'm not quite sure. But inside myself, I don't seem to be able to get over this sense that deep down, I don't deserve the kind of clarity and peace that you're embodying here. I feel that inside. I don't know what to do about it.
To that, I would say, if you did believe that you were worthy, what would you do? If you did believe that you were worthy, what would your life look like? What kind of decisions would you make? And I think that's a really powerful question, because a lot of the time, again, we're so stuck in our subjective reality, and we've been repeating these stories for a long time, right? I'm not deserving of this, I'm not deserving of that, I truly believe that I'm not. So it's also interesting, because then the more that we say it, the more that it becomes kind of like a firm reality. We say it as if it's the absolute truth. So I think a way to kind of zoom out a little bit of that subjective story is to just think, okay, so I don't feel that I'm deserving right now and that I'm worthy, right? And I don't have the kind of support system that I wish I had. But if I was someone who believed that they were worthy, what kind of decision would I make around this thing? And I think that can often give you even just a very short list of things that you can then start to action and start to become that individual. So that's a seemingly simple question that I believe can bring up some really powerful things and give you something tangible to work towards.
Okay, Africa, I just have 2 final questions for you. Here's one. I'm going to ask a personal question for a moment.
Yes.
What I realize is that I actually don't think I have that much self-censorship, sort of in terms of how I relate to myself, like, and really how I relate to other people too, except in certain situations, like with my wife, where I really want to please her. And so that's a whole complicated area, but that's not my personal question. My personal question has to do with in relating to myself and letting this come up and this come up. And I believe this, but I also believe that, which contradicts this. And then I also believe, I notice sometimes I feel a little crazy inside because I have so many different perspectives often on different things, because I let it all come forward. And I'm just curious what your sense is of that.
Right. So just for clarity, are you saying that you feel you're holding a lot of contradictory beliefs or a lot of contradictory thoughts at the same time?
Yeah, kind of contradictory thoughts or experiences or perspectives. I mean, there's a core set of values, so it's not about values, but it's just kind of like, if I look at something, I can look at it this way, and then I look at it this other way and this other way, and I'm like, whoa, there's a lot going on that, like this whole notion that we're always this coherently singular, like I can be sad and happy and afraid all at the same time. And I'm like, people don't describe our inner worlds that way, but yet I feel all of this complexity when I drop the self-censoring. So this is just my little confessional moment, but I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
I love that you say that, Tami, because that's the experience for so many people, including myself. The experience where, and for me, and this might or might not answer your question, if there is one, is that I had to really accept that, you know what, I am a contradictory being. I'm so complex from one moment to the next. Yes, there are things that I have a strong stance on. I don't think I self-censor at all, to be honest, but I'm very tuned into my social filter. All of those things that we spoke about, yes. And at the same time, there are so many different things that come up. And I think a lot of the time, people don't want to admit that, because it makes them seem as if they are, I think some people think by recognizing that and actually expressing that out loud, that it makes them seem as if they're not actually rooted in anything, that they don't stand for anything, that they're confused, or that somewhat makes them, even in certain contexts, that maybe it makes them a fence sitter, or, so many different reasons.
Or ready for the loony bin, if I really told you all the things that are going on, but yeah.
Right. So I think for some people, maybe this might be or might not be a word you would apply to what you're saying. I think for some people, it's shame. There's some kind of shame in actually admitting that, you know what, there are so many complex things that happen in my own mind And half the time I don't know. I just don't know. Um, because what you're saying, a lot of my own clients echo, and even at points in my own life, I've thought the very same thing. But I think it's just a case of not many people will own up to that. Not many people will say exactly what their internal world actually looks like because they're ashamed in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for the validation of the complexity of our inner landscape
Yes.
and making
Yes.
space for that. Now, the last
Absolutely.
question, Africa, that I wanted to ask you is that this offering that you've made on moving out of self-censorship into mindful expression is part of Sounds True's Walking Together collection of resources. And this
Yes.
collection of resources is really designed to help us uplift society as a whole, and specifically to support the healing of racism in the world. And I'm curious to know how what you've laid out in your own thinking applies specifically for people who are part of non-dominant groups and the challenges they face when it comes to mindful expression.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. And I mean, there are so many directions I could take this, but I want to sort of keep it simple and close to home. I think being a Black woman in the UK, for example, where on a percentage level, it's Black people, it's about 3%. You might find yourself in spaces where, yes, you're aware that you're the minority, but it's actually a very visible knowing because you might be the only Black person in the room, or there are just a few of you in your workplace, et cetera. You might find yourself feeling that you have to withhold parts of yourself or that you have to perform in a very specific way. Otherwise, you'll be seen in a way that isn't exactly favorable. So it's a very, I mean, this is a very complex conversation, but I think the reason why even just the session that I've done around moving from self-censorship and into mindful expression can be useful for people that are from marginalized communities, right? Because this can also apply if you're someone that is from the LGBTQ plus community as well, where you feel like you have to shrink yourself or that you have to perform in a kind of heteronormative way in order to be accepted. So I think it will look very different for each person. So I don't want to sort of give any specific examples to that because I do think it's a very personal thing. But I think it acts in the exact same way where we find ourselves in environments where we're not represented. So we feel as if we have to perform like everyone else in order to be part of it, in order to be part of the group. So yeah, that's sort of my take on that, if you will. But I do think what we've gone through today can be a really powerful process for that as well, especially the willingness to self-censor scale. If you look at that, maybe not even just through a race lens, but through a sexuality lens, through a gender lens, through anything that you would like to, I think it can allow you to kind of start to see what you can do to navigate spaces like that.
And I am going to throw one final, I guess that was the before final question, which is at the very beginning of your session, you talked about how we'll have a roadmap at the end. And I feel like I have a sense of like this further step I can take. And I have the framework that you've offered as well, which is really helpful. But I'm wondering if you could offer here any final comments on how someone can take everything that you've discussed and really turn it into their own roadmap.
I love that. I love that. So for clarity, I would say essentially the roadmap that you've taken yourself through is shaped by the 3 phases. So awareness, really understanding what your personal relationship with self-censorship actually is. The second phase is responsibility. What are your core values, right? What are your core values? What is your communication style? Really taking responsibility for the way that you currently communicate and the way that you want to communicate so that you can have results that are actually adding to your well-being or to your work situation or to whatever personal situation it might be. So the roadmap piece of that is you taking actual responsibility for what's happening internally. And then the final part is the expression piece, where you realize that, okay, this is not just going to be about externalizing everything that's coming up, everything I've taken responsibility for, but I'm going to put this to practice. So the final part is where the practice happens. That's when you transfer all of this knowledge into your daily life, into your interpersonal relationships, which is where I pose the question, what commitment are you going to be making? So that's the final part of your roadmap, where you get very clear on what your commitments are going to be, those tangible commitments that you're making.
Africa Brooke, you've offered us some good medicine. And I have to say, it is such a joy to have this opportunity to walk together with you. It's a real privilege, a real honor. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much to you and to your team, and for just allowing me to share the wisdom that I have. I'm truly grateful, truly grateful. So thank you.